Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's CDCT live session. I'm your host, Jason Rader, and with me today we have Juan Orlandini, Chief Architect, and Chris Kapusta, Principal Architect, here with me in the Insight Cloud and Data Center Transformation Group. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for being here.
Hello, Jason. Good to see you again.
Hey, Jason. Thanks for having us.
So, topic today is hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. Which one's best? How do I choose? Something along those lines, at any rate. So how do we, let's kick the topic off, right? Because I think when we say hybrid cloud, when we say multi-cloud, there's other terminology that's out there as far as cloud goes. Can we kind of rattle off like the different tiers related to cloud, and then we can kind of address those in kind afterwards?
Yeah, let me take a stab at it, and then I'm sure Chris, who actually does this stuff for a living, can dig in a little bit more. So private cloud is the stuff that we've grown up with for decades, which is where you run the infrastructure on premises in a data center that you own or you rent, but it's the stuff that you own or lease or might be using as a service. That's a whole nother subject. We have a whole nother live session where we cover that one. But the point is that it's just the stuff that's sitting on premises.
So can I interrupt? So virtualization was private cloud to all those people that are relatively new to this?
Well, let's not get into the technical.
Let's pretend I didn't ask that question. Yeah. Go back in.
Because there is that, and that's actually a very good question. What makes it a cloud? And the definition for that is up for debate, and it depends on the interpretation of the individual consumer, right? For some people, an automated virtualized infrastructure is a cloud, but the developers might actually not see it that way. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, where the developers are actually looking for more of a, here's a developer, here's my API, and then there's this thing that just makes it happen. That's the magic of the cloud. That's the way they look at it, right? And then there's this thing called cloud native, which is a whole nother thing, but we can get into that here in a second. Private cloud is stuff that's running on premises. Let's leave it at that for right now, right? Public cloud is the stuff that's running on one of the hyperscalers, and that could be somebody like a Amazon or a AWS or a Google, and there's a few others that are in that space. And the point is that it's somebody else's stuff that they manage. You just consume. You create an account. You start consuming services, whether they're as a virtual machine, dedicated machine nowadays, or as an API. A hybrid cloud is something that sits in the middle. All right. So a hybrid cloud is something where you have resources on premises, and then you have resources that are sitting in a hyperscaler or a public cloud of some sort. All right. And then the final one is multi-cloud. Multi-cloud includes the resources from multiple public cloud providers and or potentially on-premises stuff. So depending on who you ask, some people consider multi-cloud just to be the hyperscalers. Some people consider it to be multi-cloud a hybrid cloud plus multiple cloud providers. So it depends, but that's roughly the landing area and area that we're going to be talking about.
Okay, perfect. So is this, is that my evolution? Is that the path that I need to take, or, which one of those is right? Was that the loaded question that we needed to get this thing started?
It's a great question. And so let me, I'm going to take it as well and then hand it over to Chris, and maybe we can talk about it this way. The answer is yes. All right. Oh. It's possible that is.
So let's just sign off. Yeah, let's.
It's possible that a hybrid multi-cloud is your answer. It's also possible that it's not the right answer because it depends on the workload and your organization's ability to execute on those locations. There are some organizations that grew up in the public cloud and have consumed the public cloud and have built their operations teams, their DevOps teams, their everything that you can think about, including their security stances around how you build a public cloud infrastructure or consume the public cloud. Having them execute on a private cloud, build out a data center, go source all the gear that goes into a data center, stand it up, and then run it on their own, that might not be the right answer. You need a whole different skill set in order to do that, right? Vice versa, there's the private cloud folks or the private infrastructure folks. They might be trying to consume the public cloud, and that's a whole nother world. And oh, by the way, it's not just one world; it's 3 or 4 worlds if you go hybrid, because the way you manage AWS and consume AWS is completely different than the way you do Azure and GCP and Oracle and IBM and on and on and on, right? So go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask Chris, I was like, so you're the guy who does the work, right? You're in with the clients and talking to them. Are they hung up on this? Because it sounds like that's a really complicated situation. Have they arrived in that situation, or are they wondering how they get to a place that they don't know how to get there yet? What are you kind of experiencing the most?
Yeah, I think for most it's about the journey, and it's about how far we take that journey. A lot of our industry leaders that we talk to, or customers that we work with, they talk about, hey, we're going to the cloud. Does that mean just DR in the cloud? Does that mean dev test in the cloud? Is that a lift and shift of what we have on premises? Is it a re-architecture of all these apps that we've written over all the years we've been in business to take advantage of cloud native services? So it's definitely a lot about the journey. It's very easy to say we're moving to the cloud, and then the details to get there is where you start to get bogged down. There's data protection issues, there's security issues, you name it. Everything changes once that leaves your data center.
Well, Juan, you said something really interesting, because you talked about from an API perspective or developer perspective, right? So, there's probably this philosophy that exists out there with people in their cloud journey, to Chris's point of, how am I going to get there, and how am I going to consume these things that seem interesting to consume? And they're thinking about it maybe from one side of the house, and then there's this developer side of the house that's probably thinking completely different than that. Do you want to kind of enlighten us to that?
Traditional infrastructure was built around cost control and security and making sure that you had resources well managed and well organized, right? And we've all seen the data centers of the past. Yeah. Developer tools and developer approaches have changed dramatically over the last 10, 15 years, right? And that's where you saw the rise of Agile as both a capital A, which is the methodology, and Agile as in the ability to execute very quickly, right? And a lot of on-premises infrastructure, just because of the way it was built or run or executed, just wasn't suited for either of those Agiles, the capital or lowercase Agile, right? So a lot of stuff was built in the public cloud, which by its very nature is built around both of those use cases, all right? And there's a strong desire to, especially nowadays, right? There's a strong desire to take a business need and very rapidly turn it into value proposition, all right? Whether it's an internal value proposition or a new service that you're offering externally or whatever it is that you're doing, right? And the task has been put in from the line of business to the developer teams that go build that stuff. The developer team takes a look at this stuff and he goes, I got this really cool set of resources over here that I can go consume, or I can go build a business case and put in a justification and try to get my virtual machines and storage and network and security and all that other stuff lined up. I'm going to go do this. And that's awesome, because guess what? The time to value for this one is much, much shorter than this one. Right, and that's really the key driver, right? So the hybrid cloud, one of the things that we're starting to see is that our clients are asking for that same kind of an experience that you get over here, but with the resource controls and costs and security aspects that you see on premises, right? Not that you can't have those over here, but they want them over here. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? So they want the developer experience that you can do over here, but back over here on premises. Right?
Okay. And I'll add to that. I think what we're seeing in those situations is, Juan talked about the developers and the infrastructure admins. We're seeing a lot of those groups kind of mesh together going forward.
I was going to ask that.
As automation and infrastructure as code and even agile operations comes to fruition, you really start to become developers on both sides of the house, just targeting different endpoints. So.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to ask, because it sounds like there's this partnership that has to happen or should happen between the development side of the house and the infrastructure side of the house. And I was going to ask, personal experience, is that what you're seeing when you're talking to clients, or are you kind of talking to one side or the other?
No, it really has to be a two-sided conversation, and similar to as we've seen a number of customers try to go down the DevOps route, and development's doing it one way, and operations is doing it the other, and you need both aspects of them working together for that to work. And shifting to a hybrid cloud, public cloud, multi-cloud, whatever, it's really the same mentality. It's just as much of a technology shift as it is a culture and operational shift internally to that organization. So you've got to be ready to make both of those leaps in order to be successful.
Yeah, one of the going terminologies happening right now is this concept of shifting left. All right. So if you were to imagine the developer on the left-hand side and the operations on the right-hand side, is shifting more and more towards this side over here, where you have a lot of the controls, a lot of the accessibility, also the reliability and updates and operations getting closer and closer to this world. All right. The end state being is that you're developing with this in mind. All right.
Perfect, yeah.
Because you're part of it. All right. And that's truly what the DevOps ethos is, right? Then there's also the migration to being more inclusive in the DevOps world. So you see DevSecOps, right? And including security as the core tenet of the development methodology rather than a bolt-on as part of it afterwards. All right. And I know that, Jason, you live that world intimately. So.
Well, and what we're talking about here, gentlemen, it's not technology. It's leadership. It's a paradigm shift in a lot of organizations. And to that point, Juan, you mentioned something earlier that I want to pick at, because I don't think a lot of people, you talked about if folks, the developer side of the house, are used to consuming those public cloud resources in a certain manner. You talked about bringing that stuff on-prem to have the same development experience. I don't know that a lot of people talk about that. So can one of you guys kind of enlighten me on that?
So sure, let me take a stab at it, and then Chris can talk about how it's actually being done. All right. So there's a set of offerings from the hyperscalers. So AWS has Outpost, Azure has Azure Stack, and Google has Anthos. And what those are is an attempt to bring those services that the developers are used to being able to consume, but instead of having those resources live in the public cloud, living within the data center, right? So with the developer themselves, what they would do is say, hey, it's a smaller thing, so it's a little bit more resource constrained. You might not have as many APIs. And in fact, that's actually a lot of the work that's happening is expanding the offerings within the on-premises thing. But what that lets me do is write to one set of things, and then you can choose which place you run it in, either it's on-premises or on a private infrastructure version of it, right? And Chris, you've played with a lot of this stuff in the lab, which we have a fantastic lab, which is called the Research and Innovation Hub, and Chris is active all the time in there. You've seen some challenges with that stuff, right?
Yeah, I think Juan touched on some of that already, is getting API parity between what I can do in those on-prem stacks versus what I can do natively in the public cloud providers is always a challenge. And, they're constantly updating and pushing out new versions to try and get that parity. You obviously don't have as much elasticity as you do in the public cloud. So even developing at scale, while it's great to have those on-prem solutions from maybe a data security or data sovereignty issue, having the elasticity of the cloud is something that they struggle with on those systems. And you also, while it's in your data center, you still don't have as much control as you do with private infrastructure. Even though it resides inside my four walls, it's still managed a little bit by the bigger public cloud providers. There's limits to how often you have to take in updates and how far you're allowed to be behind from what they're running on their side of the house. So there's still constraints you have to work in, and you still have to operationalize around it. It's a public private cloud, I guess you could say, on inside of your data center. So all of the culture shift, all of the operational changes you have to go through to move to the public cloud, you still have to undertake to move to a lot of these services. So that being said, it's a great halfway point that these cloud providers offer for customers.
Well, there's another halfway point, Chris, and sorry to cut you off, but I want to make sure that we talk about this one before I forget. Is that there's also a meeting that's happening from the on-premises folks moving to a public cloud. So if you take a look at the offerings from VMware in particular, that everybody runs VMware to some degree or another, you're starting to see the ability to run VMware workloads natively in the public clouds, right? And the value proposition behind that, if you're talking about virtualized workloads, is that the same operations, practices, and teams and knowledge that you run on premises, now you can consume resources in the public cloud. It's not consuming the public cloud APIs necessarily, but it is letting you consume those scalable resources to do things like maybe dev test or DR or burst or whatever it is that you need to do. You can do that in the public cloud, all right? So there's a convergence that's happening from the public cloud providers trying to come on premises, and the private cloud providers trying to move up into the public cloud. And then there's a transition too to this containerized workload stuff that's kind of somewhere in the middle, all right? Yep. And everybody's battling over the control plane for that. So is it going to be the VMware that controls your container infrastructure, or is it Red Hat / IBM with their offerings? Or is it going to be one of the public cloud providers with their offerings? So it's a little bit of a hairy mess right now.
Wow. So it's not chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry, you're saying?
No, it's like, the 57 flavors of ice cream.
And then you can mix any of those. Yeah, it's a billion flavors.
That's exactly.
But on that point, so I think I totally understand that whole convergence of management tools. That makes a lot of sense to me, because from a security perspective, it's the same way. If I've got to manage something differently on-prem than I have to manage in the cloud, that complexity makes it less secure, right? But we also always talk about this aspect, because I'm still I like the idea of having my on-prem capabilities, public cloud capabilities, if you will, like you were talking about. I think we've also talked about the concept of data gravity, and how is that one of those things where if all of my data is local, that solution for the local, with Anthos or some of these other solutions, is that a better solution in some cases or all cases, or what do you guys think of that?
Go ahead, Chris.
No, I was going to say, and data gravity is a huge aspect of that cloud journey. And, part of that comes from really understanding the workloads that you intend to move to the clouds, and not only what they touch, but what it's also dependent upon them. And so, the on-prem stacks are a great compromise for that. If all of my data resides on-prem, does it make sense to try and utilize cloud resources around that? We also see some, I'll say, in-between solutions from some of the storage vendors out there. NetApp, Pure, HPE, for example, they have solutions where I can put my storage inside of a data center connected to the cloud or next door to the cloud, and still keep my data local, but utilize cloud compute and cloud bursting and everything else that the cloud brings around that data. So that gravity, as you mentioned, really helps determine where those workloads run and where they're best to run, and that's where understanding your workloads really is a huge piece of this cloud journey.
I like to say that data not only has gravity, it's also got inertia. All right. Once you start pointing data towards a location, whatever the location is, it's really hard to make a shift to a different direction. So if your data sources and your application and all that stuff is built to move stuff to a public cloud, it's really, really hard to rewrite that or retarget that so that it goes on premises. And the converse is true too. If you're generating and managing and manipulating your data on premises, having it shift to the public cloud is really hard. So you have the gravity, but it gets you there, but then you have the shift in motion that you also have to impose on that, right? And so some of these hybrid things, that's what they're designed to do, is to give you the ability to have that, both the gravity addressed by giving you multiple locations to store the stuff, but also the inertia, so you can actually take the stuff that you've used or written or processed or whatever and do it the similar way somewhere else.
That's perfect, because I was going to ask, my next question would be, if my data and data gravity, I mentioned a term that we didn't really qualify, it's basically things kind of gravitate towards where the data is, or that's the best way to use them anyway. If I've got data, my data's on-prem, typically my workloads are on-prem, I think it's the pivot point there would probably be the developers within the organization, how they want to develop and the time to value type question that comes into play at that point. Because, what stops me from just saying data's local, storage is local, let's just keep this all here? Is that an option?
Well, it is an option, but the problem is you might not have the tooling necessary in order to support that on premises. So you might not have the right so I'm going to throw it out there. Machine learning is one of the big things that's happening right now, is understanding how that strategy fits in your environment today. And one of those things that is, do you go and have a team of data scientists and data engineers and data architects go learn how to write a whole bunch of these tools, pull them from an open source location, create it, or buy some tools from some third-party providers and integrate it all on premises? So you're starting to get the drift, right? All of these tools have to be pre-built in order for you to do it, right? So what's happened is what clients will do is take a small subset of their data and they'll shift it to the public cloud. The public cloud has all of those tools available and then some, right? You can leverage a lot of the pre-built models, some of the pipelines that they already have in the public cloud, but address it with a smaller set of data that you have. And now the interesting thing about machine learning is that the more data you throw at it, the more performant your model becomes, because it learns more, right? So then there's the gravity things. How do I move all this stuff from here to there? Do I need to? What are the costs associated with that? And the flip side can be said too, is like maybe you built it so that it runs on a private cloud, on a public cloud, and you do it in a small test, and it's fantastic. You deploy it, all of a sudden your app gets downloaded by 100 million users, and you go from a few terabytes to hundreds of petabytes, and you're paying for that on a continual basis. Do I need to start sharding the data, moving it to lower tiers, or do I need it all to be available, or do I need to move it on premises? It gets complicated, and it's really an analysis that we tend to do on a workload by workload basis. Okay, you can't have a blanket answer to any of this stuff, because there's a perfectly good use case for any of these locations. All right, and understanding which one is the right one, it's going to be workload by workload.
Yeah. I'll say, to go along with that, it's just as much a technology decision as it is a business decision. I mean, we have this conversation day in and day out, is how can I use resources like the public cloud to out innovate my competition, and that time to innovation that's really measured from a business level. So all of the technology that the public cloud brings is great, but the business use cases that go along with that are heavily weighted as well. So it's conversations we're helping guide people through all the time.
Interesting. I love the workload kind of paradigm here, right? So it seems like, well, maybe I'll make a bold statement. You guys might shut me up. It seems like there's going to be kind of a hybrid model in the vast majority of cases. But you have to understand kind of where the workloads should be to begin with, right? And what are the criteria we got to figure out to do that?
Yeah, there's two of them. All right, so there's a new application, and that's exactly what Chris was talking about, right? Is, hey, I have to write this new thing and innovate and move fast, right? And what's the value to the business whether I do it here or there? And that one tends to be a decision that's done more by the business, that's telling the developers, move fast, get it done, those kinds of things, right? But then there's the old workloads, and there might be a desire or requirement to lift it from here and move it to there, or refactor it so that it lives over there. And the way you have to do that is to do a workload, now the bare minimum, a workload dependency mapping. And that's where you understand of all the workloads that you have in your environment, who's talking to whom and what do they depend on, right? And what's interesting is that there's a ton of products out there from a variety of vendors, right, that claim to do a workload dependency mapping automatically, right? And it turns out that you can't do it automatically. You have to involve people somewhere along the way. So these tools that do the automatic discovery, what they do in general is understand what is talking to whom over the network, right? And once you understand that, you start saying, well, this guy gets the input from this guy, who feeds the output to that guy, and all that. What it's not capturing is the value of to the business of each one of those workloads. All right. And it might be that this thing that's your heavy hitter from a resource consumption perspective, it's really dependent on a whole bunch of things. That if you move this guy over here, whether it's from cloud to on-premises or from on-premises to cloud, doesn't matter, right? Those other inputs that it's receiving might all of a sudden create things like latency issues, or it might create external dependencies that you didn't have anymore. You might also not capture, all right, the fact that some workloads might appear to be poorly connected. Maybe this one little guy that's sitting over here by himself that's feeding only one little thing. He might be the linchpin of your entire organization. He might be the one guy that generates the data that everything else depends on. And if you forget about him, you're not going to know about it, right? And the only way you're going to know that is by talking to the business and ask them directly, what does that guy do, right? I know he doesn't generate a lot of data, but what does that guy do? And what does that depend on, right? And Chris, you have an example. I don't know that we can get into the details of it, but we did that recently for one of our clients. It was quite a fascinating story.
Yeah. So the example I have is we have a customer who has a proprietary piece of software that is really the cornerstone of their business. They use this for expansion and growth and measuring, kind of ROI based upon that. And so it was eye-opening to understand what feeds into that internally, but it was also eye-opening for a lot of people there to understand things like the security requirements around it. I mean, not all data is created equal. Not all data is secured equally. So really understanding, not just what talks to what, but what is it feeding it and how proprietary is that to our organization and how much of that is our IP that if it was unsecured, outside of our four walls would be catastrophic to the business. So that's really, speaking to Juan's other half of that dependency mapping, not just hey, this talks over this IP to this port, they're connected, but also what is the value in the transmission of that data and the data itself.
I love that. And one of the things I think is, certainly things related to the exercise we just talked about kind of also relate to business impact analysis, relate to resiliency programs. And all the time I see different sides of the business kind of each figuring out one of those, things is important to them, but they're not kind of working together. And sometimes we have to go and bring people together at the table at the same time and kind of talk of that.
We're sometimes very much the marriage counselor, right?
Yes, indeed. Well, and so on kind of that similar line, we deal a lot with the infrastructure folks. It's just kind of the nature of how we get down a lot of times. And do you have any advice for those guys? I mean, is this strategy making them, how should they deal internally with this? I mean, what do you see in a progressive organization, how infrastructure is kind of taking the lead in some of these initiatives?
So what we're seeing is a shift to changing who the focus of the IT environment is for. All right.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right. So IT environments in the past were really end user driven. So let's focus on the end user of my resources. So if I'm a banking user, hey, I'm gonna focus on the mortgage lender, or it might be the end user on the other end that's trying to do a withdrawal from an ATM. That's who I'm focusing on. I want to make sure all that stuff is built to support that person. All right. And what we're seeing in the more progressive environments is that still remains super important. That's how you make your money, right? But focus on the developer that creates the next experience or the next application or the next capability that your business needs. And if you focus towards the developers and the developers' needs, IT organizations have an easier time merging and getting closer to where the value is being generated, because both you start working together rather than as separate things that are constantly at odds with each other, right?
Love it.
Yeah, and I'll say, a conversation we have often is, a lot of traditional IT admins take it as, hey, we're moving to the cloud. I'm going to be out of a job, and it's, it's not about that. It's not about replacing those people. It's about changing how they think. There's still infrastructure in the public cloud. I know a lot of it is API driven, but there's still networking underneath that. There's still security. There's still everything that needs to be architected. Juan likes to use the analogy. The IT organization when you're building a city, they lay the plumbing, they lay the foundation, they build the roads, and then the developers come on and put the buildings. And it's, those two teams still have to work together in the public cloud. They may work closer together, and that's absolutely okay, but they're still very important. Each aspect of that is still very important as you're building solutions there.
Yeah, I think it's also important to think, people in IT aren't valuable to the organization because they know the layers of the OSI model or how to capture packets, right? It's how they understand the business. They need to be recommending and strategic with the business, regardless of the technology, right? That's how they've got to think. And again, I love this shift of understanding who your internal customer is, because that's the answer I was looking for, because everybody's got to change. Things are changing, right? So changing the way that we think about our internal customers is an important part of that change. I love that.
Yeah, it's not and it's important to note that it's not an or, right? It's not an or statement, it's an and statement. You still have to worry about the end user, right? And get closer to the developers. So you can give those developers that experience and that capability that's needed for them. And IT's talked about being a broker for services for a long time, but you had this ongoing battle with the developers, and they created shadow IT.
Yep.
They wanted, all the developers want is, I want to get my job done, right? And honestly, all that IT wants to do is get their job done too, right? So it's not that either one of them was wrong, is they were approaching it from different ends, and that's really the progressive folks are just saying, okay, that's totally a valuable thing. Let's make sure that the developers can do their jobs. I'll continue to do my job, and then I become this broker of services, whether it's on premises or in the public cloud or whatever it is.
Well, yeah, throw security in that mix, and you either have a turf war or you've got, a real progressive organization that can change. But I mean,
exactly right.
Yeah, no, that's so. Moving a little bit to a different kind of part of this conversation. So it sounds like there's some change that's got to happen in an organization. Change typically means spend. And if we're talking about, obviously there's organizations now that are affected differently by the current economic climate than others. What do you guys, what advice for, how do we approach these things? Are there techniques? Is one model better than the other from a hybrid or multi-cloud place that gives us some flexibility when we're forced to do that innovation like you were talking about, Chris?
Yeah, I think some of that is, are we more sensitive to CapEx versus OpEx spending now in these economic climates? But I think a large portion of that is, it can be expensive to lift and shift, or it can be expensive to make that move or that journey. And it's, driving back to that, understand the workload mentality. It's really about right sizing as you do it. It's very easy to spin up massive systems in the cloud and run your workloads there. And yeah, they'll perform great until you get the bill. And so it's, a lot of it is just about, if I understand what the requirements are and what the needs are before I move things, I can right size up front and save a lot of that wasted spend and that headache and heartache and everything else. So again, just beating that mantra of it's all about the workloads. It all starts with understanding that as we make that journey.
And you mentioned, Chris, CapEx and OpEx. Those are financial models on how to manage your money. Both of them are designed to do that, right? Mm-hmm. One has a longer term view as to what you are doing by capitalizing it over a longer period. Another one is really more of a lease mechanism, but although that's actually changed. So the FASB rules changed what you can OpEx, right? There's a new movement amongst providers to provide everything as a service, even on-premises equipment, right? We have a whole nother CDCT live that we discussed on what those changes are, but that gives you different flexibilities, and it really is dependent on what your cash management strategy is. And in today's world, there's really three different kinds of strategies broadly painted, right? There's the folks that are financially heavily impacted by what's going on, and they gotta just make sure they get to the other end, period. All right. So button up all the hatches and all that, but keep the business running. Right. So for those, maybe cash preservation is the most important thing. There's another cohort of organizations that are somewhere in the middle. They don't know what the world's going to look like in the near future. They don't understand whether it's going to be a really long-term hit or it's a short-term hit. And so for them, it's important to make sure that the business continues to run, but to innovate and not be predatory to what's going on, but to take advantage of the new world that we live in, right? And then there's the final one that has really exploded, right? That is accelerated. There's collaboration, there's video conferencing, all those things that are just exploding nowadays. And for those organizations, velocity is the most important thing. And cash management isn't still important, but it's not the overriding motivator, right? And so for them, velocity, public cloud, you're not going to get faster than that. You can infinitely scale on that one. So you just got to make sure that you understand which one of those you are and what it is. And it's not a black and white, because it might be the portions of your business are down, portions of your business are exploding, and you manage them separately, right? Nothing is an all-in kind of a conversation.
Oh, I love it. So it sounds like the gold nuggets of this are that regardless of financially where we are in the economic situation that's going on right now, we're not stifled from an innovation perspective. We can still innovate. A lot of this stuff happens inside the organization, is where a catalyst for a lot of this is going to happen. And what better time than where you can't outlay a lot of CapEx than to maybe start figuring out internally how we can come out of this a lot stronger. I love that. And then another thing that I think you both said at different times is understand the workloads. So know thyself seems to be a big theme here. And we don't have to wait. It'd be horrible if you're sitting there watching the world take off and leverage a lot of these capabilities. But it doesn't appear that it's exclusively for one financial, for the people that are taking off or not. It seems like with the appropriate planning and shift, whether it's CapEx or OpEx, it's more important to you that everybody can take advantage of this.
It's not only that, and it's interesting that you said innovation can still happen. I will say that innovation has to happen. You have to innovate,
for sure.
Right? And so digital transformation is part of that innovation process that everybody's going through. I've never had more boxes come to my house than over the last 3 months, right? So everything from food to clothing, you name it, it's all a device, or it's an app or a website or something that's driving that. So you have to transform or transform. I think I made a new word up.
Transformate. I got to register that real quick.
So it's imperative that you do it. So the question is how and where you do it, and it depends. And it's based on the workload and your developer experience, as well as your end user experience and all those things, right? So there's no right answer, but there's also not a wrong answer in any of this, right?
Oh, I love that. So, how I like to end these things is, obviously folks know we do this kind of stuff, but if they were going to kind of endeavor to tackle some of this stuff on their own, where would you guys point them?
Go do that workload analysis. It's one of the single most important things you have to do. All right. But don't forget that you have to do both sides of the coin, right? They're intimately tied together. Understand the technical side, which is how everything depends on each other.
Yep.
But you have to understand how the business does it, and you have to do it effectively. All right.
And that's free. I also often find that IT doesn't really talk to the other side of the house. They should talk back. It's one of those things where, and I'm not just picking on IT, but those guys will give you that information if you ask. And it's one of those things where, once that inertia happens, it becomes contagious within the organization. I think it's good stuff.
Once you have that, then you can start doing the math. Hey, how do I, if I take this workload or this that I'm trying to move or transform, where do I do it for the most cost-effective way, right? That can take a little bit of research, can take a little bit of stuff. That's not so free. The providers, whether on premises or in the cloud, make it kind of challenging. But that's okay. There's ways around that. There's tools and methodologies. Some we can provide, some you can go and invent on your own, or whatever it is. But you have to tie those two together, right? And if you're looking at new workloads, a very important thing is that you don't have a junior developer making multi-million-dollar decisions for you. We had that actually brought up by one of our clients that said, hey, I'm not making this decision. I'm giving my development team this requirement to go build something. A junior developer then says, oh, I know how to do that. And they build it over here, wherever over here is. Yep. Then that application takes off. And guess what? Once it's built there, yep, it's going to be hard to move it. Right. And so make sure you understand that aspect of it, too. So you don't paint yourself into an accidental corner, whatever that corner happens to be. That's
the Jurassic Park methodology, right? You were so worried about whether you could, you never thought of whether you should.
Yeah, that's exactly.
That's the advice I like to leave with as well. Is everybody's worried about the destination, but they don't pay enough attention to the journey. And the more effort, the more thought, the more planning you put into that journey, the better you enjoy that destination. And so it's not a sprint. It's proper planning, and if all of that work's put in up front, you'll have a much better experience in wherever you land in that matrix of on-prem, hybrid, multi-cloud, whatever. So,
fantastic. Well, gentlemen, it has been a pleasure talking to rock stars like yourselves about this topic. I appreciate it. For those of you who would like to know more, please visit us at insightcdct.com. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Juan.